Good evening, followers of HateFree culture. It is my pleasure to welcome you at HateFree Talk, a series of live stream interviews with unique people from the Czech Republic and abroad. Today, I send my greetings from Johannesburg, South Africa, and we will speak in English, as it is my honor to introduce my today's South African guest, Thando Hopa. Thando is a fashion model and an advocate of diversity who has made her work globally. Her portfolio includes her background as a sexual offense prosecutor in the regional court at the National Prosecuting Authority. She's an international fashion model, an actress, and a culture leader. As you already know, it will not be only about my questions. You are very welcome to post your comments and questions under this live stream, and I will pass them to Thando on your behalf. The interview will be led in English only, but in future it will appear transcribed in Czech on our new website. Thando, good evening, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's a big pleasure.
Good evening, everybody. Dumelang Sanbonani. And how do you say hello in your language?
Ahoy.
How do you say it?
Ahoy.
Ahoy. There you go. So greetings to everybody, and thank you for granting me audience.
When did you realize you look different from people around you? And I mean, probably the most important, did you feel different yourself?
Ooh, okay, that's a bit of an interesting question. Because you know, I grew up probably up until the age of 4 and 5. I don't think I really understood social stratifications or particularly felt them. Maybe gender, you know. Maybe I may have understood what gender stratifications mean in that girl, boy, etc. But in terms of my body having any kind of political consequence, I think I realized that really when I went to school the first time. And actually, that's not even entirely complete, because when I went to school the first time, my mother put me in a polka dot dress. It was a blue polka dot dress with white polka dots, and everybody at school had school uniforms. So she spoke to me because I was so excited when I went to school. I was so excited. And she spoke to me and she said to me, listen, I don't have your school uniform as yet, but I'm going to make sure that I get you your school uniform soon, okay? And I was like, oh, okay, no problem. And then I get to school and I'm the only one in this blue polka dot dress. And when I get to sitting with a couple of kids, I sit down and somebody says, don't sit next to her. And you know, the first thing I thought about is it's this dress that's the problem, you know, because I had never had any reference of my body being any kind of social or political issue. So I thought, I went to my mother and I said to her, I want you to make sure that you bring me school uniform tomorrow. I was absolutely unyielding in how hysterical I was. And then, you know, she made sure that I had the school uniform. But of course, things didn't change because it was beyond the polka dot dress. But I think that was a time when I started understanding that, wait a minute, there is sort of a consequence to having a body like mine, because I grew up in Lenasia South, and Lenasia South, particularly, you know, 1994, 1995, still predominantly, some people could describe it as a township, but it was predominantly filled with people of color. So I literally, wherever I went, I was the only person who had skin like mine. And yeah, in the initial part of my childhood, it was quite a difficult thing to digest. And also, you know, beyond just skin color, there were things that you're trying to understand your body, you know, as a child. You don't know that you're short-sighted. You just know that you look on the board and the board looks like, you know, the teacher writes an 8 down and it looks like a 0, or does it look like a 6? You don't know what's going on with you. You don't know that you're short-sighted. You just know that everybody around you seems to be copying on the board just fine, and you're the one who's struggling. And for a long time, actually, and when I say long time, I probably say maybe 3 months of my childhood, I would act like I see on the board because I didn't want to keep feeling like I was the odd one out. I was the different child consistently. So I would literally just write scribbles on my books until my parents intervened, thank God. But yeah, so I'd say five,
But,
6, that's when I realized all of that.
but did your parents talk to you about that before you went to school, or they just reacted after that when things started to happen? Did you have this discussion with them?
You know, my mother never really sat down with me until a later age, I would say, to try and explain to me that I have albinism, or perhaps also is that she didn't really know how to communicate the subject, but I think she never wanted to maybe preempt a sense of difference within me when she had tried to cultivate. I mean, my family cultivated the sense of belonging and my sense of completeness just fine. And I think that she was hoping that she would give enough assurance to me to kind of battle it out when I get to school, you know, to figure my own path. I think she may not have wanted to preempt that path for me. And yeah, no, so we never really spoke about it. And to be honest with you, I wouldn't say to any parent that it's right or wrong. I think that she did it the best way she could. Mm.
You mentioned the problems with your sight when you didn't see what is on the blackboard. I think that many people who are watching don't really know why or what you are talking about.
Okay.
Can you explain a bit?
So the thing with albinism is that there is a lack of pigmentation that runs through the body, and it also runs through the hair, skin, and eyes. And, you know, I always thought this was quite interesting because if you are, for instance, a person with blue eyes, but you have pigment, so a lot of, let's say, Caucasian people, or let's just say white people, you'd find that there's a segment that has blue eyes or that has green eyes. And they would not necessarily or automatically be short-sighted, even though there is a lack of pigmentation in the eyes. But with regards to albinism, because the pigmentation runs through the whole body, including the nerves that require pigmentation for sight, it makes you have, like, you could have your blue eyes, but you'll probably also be short-sighted. It's generally inherent in the condition, but the variations of sight are not the same. So you could have people with albinism with generally decent sight, but most of the time you will be short-sighted.
You mentioned the time when you went to school as the critical one, when you first met this kind of, let's say, stigma or prejudice, probably. It's very often, I think it's not common just with people with albinism or children with albinism, but with all children that are different, like in Czech Republic, for example, with Roma children. They come to school when are not non-Roma children. What was it like after? I mean, you just mentioned this first moment and when you thought that it's the polka dot dress that you had, but how was it for you when you realized it's not just that? And how did you cope with that? What was happening like later? Because I think it was a long process.
You know what? It was, the best way I can explain it is that it was a slow kind of violence. Because, you know, it's one thing to start understanding that in reference to you, you're being treated differently, but then came, you know, with time, there was name calling. There were specific names that were used to describe my existence. And then you grow up to becoming, let's say, a teenager, trying to understand attractiveness and understanding that your existence is culturally devalued in almost each and every respect. And it was just, you know, I think I was dealing with a dynamic that I couldn't reconcile myself with, because I had my parents, my family, where I was so accepted, so loved. And then I would go into other environments outside that sanctum, And I would almost have to go through a constant risk or threat analysis of the environment. You know, I was always sort of hyper vigilant, always anticipating some kind of, I'd say, emotional or psychological harm, not necessarily a physical harm. Because to be honest, my understanding of that also happened much later in my life. But it was just, the best way I can explain it is it was a slow kind of violence, because it took a while for me to really understand what difference means within the cultural and societal context. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, perfectly. But what was behind that violence, you think? Like,
you know, I think
people understand, like, why people
what was
treat
behind it?
people with albinism like that sometimes at some places.
Do you know what? This question, I think, is bigger than anything I can quite answer. All right. I'm going to sort of give you an answer that I always tend to feel like is an oversimplification. So I do have to start with that disclaimer. Now, albinism, because I've lived this existence in many contexts. What I understood is that if you're looking more within sort of the historical understanding or interpretation of albinism within the African context, it moved between natural and supernatural somewhat. I'd say that would be the, you know. So in some contexts, and please, I need to stress, this is not within all African contexts. Even within South Africa, it is not within all groups. But there's certain groups of people who have certain kinds of beliefs, and those beliefs would be, for instance, you know, are you an omen? Are you good luck? Or are you some kind of subhuman? But the interesting thing about this is that within the Western context, it's not entirely different. It's just that it's framed differently. Because, you know, when I think about how I first, for instance, started learning about albinism, they would talk about it as a genetic disease, a genetic disorder, or, you know, an abnormality. And that's why I say it's a slow kind of violence, because you're consuming the language of the culture, the perceptions of the culture with regards to your body. And I think in the Western context, because also there was an issue of albinism consisting of a disruption of racial ideologies, you know. You see that within that history, which is a long story, I don't know if we'll get into it, but within that history, you see that when they tried to explain the issue of race with regards to albinism, the best way, or the cop-out, was to say it shouldn't have happened. This kind of existence shouldn't have happened. Therefore, it's an abnormality. And you start seeing centuries later how the consequence of that in the culture, and the consequence of that on your body. Because when you're reading, oh, albinism is a genetic disease, something in you cringes. And that's why I say it's a violence, because something happens to your body, but you don't have the language for it. You just know that there's this interaction that you had with culture, society, or politics. And when you're young, you don't have the language to understand what's happening to you. You just feel this tightening or this dying inside your body that you can't explain. And I consider that to be a violence. So, yeah.
I would now read a comment that we have here from Kwame Andrews Daklo, who is a Ghanaian activist with albinism. He writes, I can vividly relate to this experience. I remember I couldn't write notes and always write nonsense in my book, which I hardly read or understand. So it's exactly like sharing your own experience from different countries. I will just use this moment to say that you can also, other people, write your comments, and you can write them also in Czech. If you can't write English, I will translate it for Thando. So don't worry about your English, and feel free to write your comments or questions. You kind of touched it. Like the stories that come to the world about people with albinism on African continent are very often scary, full of violence and stigmatization. But Africa is a very big continent, and we in Europe very often forget about that. Like we say, we go to Africa, and not that we go to Ghana or South Africa. I mean, in your point of view, in South Africa, that is, at least on paper, the most liberal and open country on the continent. How is the situation of people with albinism? Because I mean, the stories we get are mostly from like Uganda, Tanzania, where there is a lot of real violence. People are being killed. In South Africa, as far as I know, there are quite several TV communities or people who are publicly active, and they are praised, I would say, by some kind of people. So it looks like that the situation is maybe a bit different.
I think, and I have to put this disclaimer before I answer, because I prefer for generally NGOs to answer this particular question, because they generally have the correct audit of the situation, and I can really kind of tell you an overview from engaging with NGOs, but generally NGOs have a mandate and an audit to be able to speak on sort of behalf of persons with albinism.
Like some kind of your point of view. I mean, it's kind of
yes. That's why I'm just saying that I just have to contextualize my particular answer. But with regards to South Africa, now I think one of the things that have happened in recent history is at least you've received punitive measures for the violence that has happened to persons with albinism. But it's actually, I mean, I think we're beginning to also grow in terms of data collection. Initially, there was very little data with regards to albinism. And even now, if you're looking for certain kinds of crimes that are influenced by people who have albinism, or people who have albinism are targeted, sometimes you don't have the data with regards to that. But South Africa, I think, is going through sort of a sense of improvement. You're also seeing there's a bill on disability legislation. So you're beginning to see that there is an effort to structurally deal with issues of persons with albinism. And even, to be honest, even with regards to Tanzania, I think ever since there is a lady called Ero, she has done a great deal of work in Tanzania, and the violence that has occurred in terms of the killings of persons with albinism has reduced significantly over the past 5 years, I would say. But the problem is that it's gone into Malawi. But in terms of that, I would definitely say that there's progress, but there's so many other areas that we don't really look at when it comes to trying to understand the fullness of the issues of persons with albinism, issues like education, workplace. And I realized that there is sort of a silence because we are not quite investigating the issues there. But in terms of violence, I would say that there is an improvement. But it's also a little bit. I don't want to say that too quickly, because we are an extreme minority, and to kill one person because of their skin in an extreme minority, if you're let's say 50,000 in the country, it's different if you are 5 million in the country, so it just I would like to bring forward that context. But yes, I would say that there is improvement. One of the things that has actually hit for me is, there was a woman who, and at that time she was not that far away from being my age. Her name was Thando, and she got, and this was I can't remember which year it was, but it was just a few years ago. And when she got dismembered, I remember that the UN expert said that was one of the most, that case entirely shook her. And you know, it's just, yeah, it's a lot, but I do think that there is movement. But the stuff that has happened has been quite traumatic, I would say, with regards to the community.
Mm-hmm. Your situation is very special in many ways, because one of them is that the fact that you are a Black woman with white skin. I mean, if I'm not wrong, or if I say it correctly, how do you yourself identify?
How do I self-identify?
Yeah, like in this matter, if it is not too personal question, you know?
I think the most prominent identity that I identify with depends on context, to be quite honest with you. You know, if I am, let's say, in a space within the Eastern Cape and I have to introduce myself, I will say, oh, you know, that is my Xhosa heritage. I would predominantly identify myself as Xhosa. But in certain other contexts, I would identify myself as Black, sometimes as a Black woman, sometimes as a person with albinism, sometimes as a woman with albinism, you know, but it depends a great deal of the time on the context. But I think, you know, first and foremost, I think that we probably all identify ourselves as human, but our context sort of invoke a certain kind of identity to be prioritized within that context, sometimes because that particular identity could be embraced, or sometimes because that particular identity could be under attack. It depends. And I'll give you an example when I say a particular identity under attack is that, for instance, if you are walking around an unsafe place, let's say in the streets of Johannesburg, just an example, and as soon as nighttime hits, probably the identity that is foremost in my mind is my womanhood, you know. Albinism would not really be the first thing on my mind, you know, because I'd understand that that particular identity is entirely fragile. So my womanhood would be the thing that would be at the forefront of my mind. But if I am in a different space where I know that, and there are certain provinces where the data of violence of persons with albinism has been higher than any other province, in that province, my albinism is at the forefront of my mind, you know. So that's what I'm saying. I honestly believe that identity is quite contextual. So yeah.
Yes, why I asked this maybe with question was because for many people who are out of the context, can be quite surprising if you identify yourself as, for example, Black woman because of color of your skin, and that's what I was kind of going to.
You're going
it's part of your identity, because if maybe some European person would see you, they would maybe identify you more as a white. I don't know, but there is this kind of discrepancy. And
yes, I think that's quite interesting, because there's a dominant understanding of what Blackness would ordinarily look like. But one thing that my body has entirely taught me is that Blackness is an institution. Race is an institution. It's an institution that we've inherited probably 400 years ago or so. And within that institution, it's created sort of barriers and privileges just depending on which race you fell under. And those consequences are century-old consequences that I still experience today. During apartheid, people with albinism, or Black people with albinism, never passed for white. There isn't that history till today. I have not found a history that says that there was a time when Black people with albinism could pass for white. They were Black, and that therefore they fell within Black circumstances and Black consequences for apartheid. So I have inherited that consequence. And not just that, it's just that, you know, and perhaps maybe might be a bit more controversial, but there is, you know, when you had the racial stratifications of Negroid, Mongoloid, Caucasoid, you know, there was a phenotype that was associated with Blackness, that, you know, lips, kinky hair, nose. And I also realized that even when I moved into the fashion industry, how that phenotype is also culturally devalued. And it is a phenotype that I carry as a Black woman. So, yeah.
At one conference that I saw a video from, you talked against the word of albino, promoting the term of person with albinism that we use here today. Why? Why it's not appropriate to use that word?
I think one of the things, and, you know, particularly, I noticed that within the African context, we generally understand, and I say generally because I cannot speak for everybody, but when we formed the Global Albinism Alliance, I understood that within the African context, we generally were on the same page on the term albino. We were not, we were sort of unequivocal in how we felt about the term, and that it is a derogatory term. And possibly because we also have inherited an entirely racialized history, albino is, you know, there's actually a professor who gave such an interesting example. He said, you know, when you're looking at early European literature, they would say, oh, I saw an albino, and they'd be talking about an animal. And then later on in European literature, they say, oh, I saw an albino, and they'd be talking about a human being. And one of the issues that I have is that the term is interchangeably used with a non-human. And that is extremely triggering when it comes to bodies that have had a racial history where their humanity was denied or placed in the same form as sort of non-human. Because I don't even want to particularly, you know, if I say animals, it's a more complicated thing when you're looking at Homo sapien, la 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 la. But in terms of humanity, I prefer persons with albinism because it just sets the record straight. So yeah.
But is the language that important? Like, does it matter how you call people if they still think something else, maybe? You know, that's what people sometimes argue.
Say.
Yeah, like about the terms, that they like to, if we use politically correct terms, that maybe the person who use them still thinks something else and hiding them.
Do you know, I think I've got two answers to that question. The first is that call people what they want to be called. Call people what they call themselves. We have a history of, you know, where especially through colonization, where people were named what they never called themselves, what they never identified as, and they had to now. Because the thing about naming is naming comes with definition, and after definition comes a whole institution. When they named Negroid, that came with an entire consequence, centuries-long consequence that we're all fighting off even today. But I would say call people what they want to be called. That's the first thing. But also is that naming has a very, and I suppose it leads to my first answer, is that naming has a very interesting way of sort of governing how we interact with one another. And also it has a way of sort of governing the consequence of that. So, and I'll give you an example that doesn't have to particularly deal with albinism. You know, I was doing a great deal of work recently with regards to the Gua community. In South Africa, they would call it sort of Khoisan. And one of the critiques that came is with regards to the name San or Basarwa, or you know, the many words that were used to basically say that these people don't have land, or these people don't own anything, or whatever the case may be. And one of the issues with the naming there is that the entire literature started speaking about, you know, this group of people as if they're people who should not own anything. And then when you're looking at legislation, they also started responding to this group of people as if they're people who don't own anything, you know? So when it comes to any kind of identity group, call people what they want to be called, but also understand that it has an institutional consequence. So yes, I think naming matters very much. And I'll give you, just going back to albinism, is that if I look at the term albino, if I look at the Xhosa term inkawu, which means monkey, if I look at the Zulu term ishawa, which means curse, if you look at the consequence of all of that, it's had a real consequence on human lives. That naming did not become irrelevant in terms of human lives, because it's in essence became a component or a weapon to dehumanize certain bodies. So yes, naming matters.
Mm-hmm.
In a nutshell.
Today you are a successful international model.
Mm-hmm.
How did the journey happened? Because a few years ago, I mean, or maybe a little bit more, a few years ago, we didn't really see people with albinism on cover pages of magazines. Like, how did your journey happen?
So, okay, when I actually started, there was, I think the only person who I knew who was prominent, who had albinism, was Salif Keita. And I moved sort of into the modeling fraternity. I got scouted. And at that time, I was a full-time prosecutor. But I was what you call an aspirant prosecutor, like a candidate prosecutor. So I was going through my first year of prosecution. And then I got scouted by a designer, a South African designer, and he asked me to model for him, which at the time I thought was just, I was like, no ways, like I'm a lawyer, you know, like I don't do that stuff. But then I ended up agreeing, because my sister said to me that it could help change perceptions around albinism in particular. And I went to him and I said to him, I'm like, okay, you know what, Gert, I will do this thing. Now, Gert is the designer who scouted me. And I said, I will do this modeling thing. And, but I said to him, I want to represent albinism in a positive way. That's what I had said. And it was quite an interesting thing, because when I started moving into the media space, I started understanding how many identities that were actually sort of going through harmful representation that I embodied. So, you know, race, gender identity, albinism identity, being an African. So I was going into a bigger fight than I had initially, you know, anticipated. But I would sort of do the modeling ad hoc, because I was a full-time prosecutor. After 2 years in the district court, I went into the regional court. I worked on rape cases. So I didn't prioritize the modeling. I did it, but I just didn't prioritize it, because I had more urgent cases to deal with. And I would just do sort of the modeling 3 or 4 times a year. I only really went into it full time when I resigned as a prosecutor, just sort of like many moons ago. But yes, and then I went full on into modeling.
Yeah. When you spoke about your experience at school that affected your self-confidence, as you explained, was modeling the way how you could build your self-confidence?
I think that's.
Did you gain your self-confidence at all? I mean, in the end.
You know, I think when I was a teenager, specifically, I had my self-confidence became very fragile. The constant, you know, noting of cultural devaluation entirely exhausted a lot of components that I had with regards to just who I was as a young woman. And then I went into varsity. And when I went into varsity, I decided, you know, I'm just going to sort of put up a persona for myself. And I was going to be confident. I almost made that decision that I'm going to be confident. But at that time, I used to do like all of these interesting things. And every time I bring this up, I have to always put the disclaimer that this wasn't it's not a judgment of a beauty choice. But when I was in matric, I went to color my brows and my lashes. And my mother was shocked because I left looking one way in the morning and then I came back looking another way in the afternoon, and she had a heart attack. But I went to my peers, and when they saw now this, I now had my brows colored, and they thought it was awesome. And I think that was the first time I felt like I assimilated successfully into what the culture considered attractive, something the culture considered worthy of acceptance. And that put me on some kind of high because it felt so good. It felt so good to be accepted. And it wasn't something that I was willing to let go of easily. Now, when I went into a modeling career, now I had completely, gone into the space where I had found a way where I could navigate my spaces with more social ease. And I remember that when I did the Forbes shoot, the lady was asking me, the makeup artist was asking me if I want to, do I want to dye my brows, or not dye, but do I want to color my brows, or do I want to go clean? She called it the clean look. And I said, clean look? I'm like, what's a clean look? She's like, no, the clean look is like your sort of bare minimum. So you still put on makeup. It's not a no makeup look. You still put on makeup. But she just said, it's just, like the bare minimum. And I sort of had this deep moment. And because I thought to myself, I'm like, what you see now, that's more or less the clean look. And I thought to myself, Jesus, like if I have this look, it could take me back to sort of a form of secondary trauma, like it would take me back to a time when I was not accepted. And then I thought to myself, but you said you want to represent albinism in a positive way. So the phenotype of albinism is the lack of pigmentation in even the hair. And that unique, or not, maybe not even unique, but rare phenotype, why wouldn't you embrace that? And then I said to her, I'll do the clean look. But I can tell you that as soon as we did the shoot, I could not go out. I still put on I colored my brows immediately because I was like, not too much for one day. I can't do all of this, on a consistent basis. It actually took a lot of time for me to get to a point where I really became comfortable with what you would, let's say, call the clean look, because I had to have a different relationship with the phenotype of albinism, because it was the phenotype that's my body. And so, so it was quite interesting that out of all things, modeling triggered that conversation. You wouldn't have expected that would have been the space, but that was the space.
In the last year or two, I see that quite many, I would say, labels, companies all around the world hire models with albinism to represent their brands. Why do you think that happened? Is it that they just like the person, how the person looks, or do they think there is something else behind it? Or maybe your experience around that, because you became face of some of the brands yourself?
I try not to occupy myself too much with trying to figure out a lot of intentions of the brand. What I try to occupy myself with more than anything is the outcome of the project, because the thing is, in an entirely capitalist society, a great deal of brands will want to do whatever it is that they want to do for commercial benefit. But what I try to focus on is, especially with regards to albinism, when there was such an absence of representation, I focused more on whether there is representation and how people are going about that representation. So I honestly, if I could say, do I know why brands do this? I don't entirely know. Some people would say that, you know, people are commodifying albinism, or, you know, they see albinism as some kind of trend. And when I had those conversations directed to me, I always found them very strange, because I don't know if white women were ever asked why they were being represented. You know what I mean? I feel like we almost have to justify why we're in our spaces. And even the word trend in itself, it almost makes it sound like you are sort of a passing phase, but there is that undertone that says you're not supposed to be here, you know? And I don't agree with that sentiment at all. I think we need to take up space in every avenue we can. So yes, but more than anything, I look at the outcome of the representation, not so much the intention of the brands. I mean, geez, yeah, we have entirely a toxic capitalist culture. I think if I went into that, I'd fall into the rabbit hole. So yeah.
I can imagine that fashion industry is not just about beautiful dresses and beautiful faces. I think it's also can be very harsh. And are there any challenges that you had to face because of your condition, because of that you live with albinism and issues that come around it?
I think, you know, one of the things that have been absolutely interesting is that beauty is an entirely political concept, you know, and I have never understood it more than when I went into the fashion and beauty industry, because, you know, whether it's with regards to race, or whether it's regards to gender, albinism, there was always sort of some kind of politic or body politic that you would find yourself in. And if I look at it, for instance, with regards to albinism, when I started modeling, they would just say, they would write albino model shatter stereotypes, albino model this. And I thought, geez, I don't have a name in these headlines. And I didn't have a name for a while. I thought, how did you get to a position where you're talking, you want to do, let's say, a human interest story or whatever the case may be, and you completely unname me and reduce me to just a condition? It's like you're watching your humanity leave you through how it's being documented, you know? And I think, like, you know, it was quite sort of a deep process, because I would do, let's say, a fashion article, and then I would read, and the article maybe is about lifestyle and fashion, and they would start with albinism as a genetic disorder, la la la. And I think, oh, is this a medical article, or is it a fashion article? But there was almost that insistence on always re-invoking there's something different about you, and there's something about you that's not quite supposed to be here, you know? And yeah, so I think it was a great deal of things. I think if we were to try and unpack all of them, we would be here all day. But yeah, I think there was quite a bit of stuff. And I think also it's just when we had that conversation earlier about African albinism, being Black, being African, having albinism, that created an entirely different framework, because you're trying to you know, reimagine what people understand beauty to be through popular culture. But wherever I went, despite the context, the issues of, you know, the violence of persons with albinism was raised in such a way that I think it destabilized even the intention of raising awareness. Instead, it just reinforced stereotypes of how people thought Africa is. And also it created a situation where it was as if our humanity could not be imagined outside of this particular story, this particular issue. And it's not to say that that story is not important for us to speak about, because it's absolutely important. But it became so consistent, so consuming, and so unyielding in how the narrative would refuse to diversify, that I started understanding that it was actually sort of a method of exclusion. But yeah.
Were there any requests from your clients or photographers, fashion designers, that you did not accept or you did not do because they felt offensive towards you? You know,
I did plenty of that. I think I did plenty of that. I did so much of that that I think it even made me, I actually feel like, and I always said that, modeling in law is the business of representation. And I was not joking, because, being, the decisions that I had to make to even get to certain points in my career were very, very difficult. To, not even just in terms of albinism, but also in terms of gender, because I would almost feel like there is a way the fashion industry would interfere with your sovereignty as a woman on what to do with your body. And, I had to try and bring in the concept of sovereignty for myself in a mannequin culture. So modeling, you're the mannequin. You do what the client says you should do. And I was going in with the sense of sovereignty and agency to say that, no, but I'm not going in this as a mannequin. I'm going in this to collaborate on what we are going to archive into the culture. So I think gender came with all of that. Albinism, people have come with a lot of strange things, but I think one of the things that, and I'd say this works more in film and television, one of the things that created more of a complication is that, especially in Western productions, the representation of albinism as being sort of supernatural and otherworldly really creates a conundrum for a body that lives within the African space. So they can, let's say, oh, we want to cast you as a witch, in a very big production. That's not an easy request for me to deal with, right? Because they say, well, we could cast you as a witch, but this is acting. It's all, done for, it's in the art space, so that you can do whatever it is that you want. And this is the funny thing about identity, because if I was a white woman with albinism, I might not have that issue. Maybe I might have the issue to say, if you cast me as a witch, it creates sort of a niche, a niche, and I don't want that. I want to be seen as an actor fully. But as an African woman with albinism who is Black, there is a consequence to supernatural representation that I am entirely sensitized toward. So that creates sort of a dynamic, but that dynamic is really embedded within the issues of identity and context. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. There is a comment from Radka Limla-Benz that connects to what you just said, partly. Thando, thank you for sharing your story. It broadened my perspective about the importance of the language we use around and about people. How do you feel about the word race when defining your identity? I have always felt funny about this word, since it is also used for both humans and animals. Can you think about an adequate alternative?
It's a very deep question. To be honest, I have not thought about that. And it's a very good question. I'm going to stew on it. But there's something somebody said, and I forget the person who I'm going to quote, I forget his name. But he said, we teach kids that race is real, but race does not matter, when the opposite is true. Race is not real, but race does matter, And I think this is the the dynamic that we're also just trying to deal with in terms of the consequence of this institution that we have now found ourselves in, is that we're trying to deal with the reality that race as a concept is really, it's really the imagination of human beings that has gotten us to this point. But it has serious economic, legal, cultural, social, political consequences. And I think in order for, we're still probably a long way to see how we're going to negotiate, how to try and work to a more redemptive future. But we can't, at the same time, we can't sort of ignore the fact that this was a term that was used 500 years ago, that's made its way into legislation, that's made its way into, you know, economics, that's made its way into culture. So yeah, I don't know, I'll think about it. I'll definitely, it's a very good question, I'll think about it. But I definitely know that it's not a term we can ignore. That's for sure. That's definitely for sure. Yeah.
You graduated in law and you served as a prosecutor, as you said already, of mostly sexual violence offense acts.
Yeah.
Was it a topic that you chose intentionally, or did it just land on your table?
So I actually got taken to the regional court quite early, because generally you go to the regional court after 4 years. But my senior prosecutor at the time said to me, you know, I really think that in order for you to grow this space, because I was in the district court, she said, I don't think this space will allow you to grow in the way that your skill set, in the way that fits your skill set. So she said to me, would you consider going to the regional court? And I said to her, yes. But I was interested in sexual offenses. And the reason why I was interested in sexual offenses is because there was research that I had done, quite, it wasn't like a thesis type of research. It was just for a small project when I was back in law school. And it was on the idea of consent. And I started understanding that there's a bit of, I would even go as far as to say gender disparity on the understanding of consent. And so when I went into sexual offenses, I suppose I was just trying to understand what was going wrong within our country. Also just for me to understand what was going wrong as a woman, you know, because I wanted to be able to have this kind of body and move within my spaces with ease and feel safe and feel secure. So when I went to sexual offenses, I thought, you know what, I'm going to find a way to, you know, bring justice into our environment. But it's always very complicated, hey.
Well, I just wanted to ask, were you successful and satisfied in the end with probably where I wanted to ask if you were successful and satisfied with your work in the end, because as I know, it's just few percent of the cases that are actually revealed, and like perpetrator is put in jail in the end. So it can be quite frustrating for a prosecutor, I think.
You know, I think one of the things that generally as a prosecutor, you generally take a case to court when you feel it's trial ready. In that you take a case to court where you see that the facts prima facie or on the surface will bring forward a conviction. And I think that's what we try to do a great deal of the time. And I think we did it as best as we could. But one of the things that sexual offenses sort of taught me, because it was interesting, we did sexual offenses, but we also did crimes relating to children, is that patriarchal violence, well, we call it gender-based violence, but that kind of violence sort of filters through. It can be how a husband treats his wife, how a mother treats their child. You know, it can be sort of there's a power dynamic that is inherent in the use of violence. There's a pattern in how we decide to respond to people who are culturally and socially more vulnerable than we are. And I think that there's a deeper question that we need to ask ourselves as a society. And I was asking myself that question all the time as a prosecutor, I would say. Just in terms of how we use violence as a tool to either control or, you know, how do we also just find better ways of accountability management, not even just within the legal system, but within the cultures that we have. So yeah, it was a very deep process for me, I have to tell you. It was a lot. It was a lot.
You said you quit. Do you miss that job?
Do you know, I didn't feel like I quit. I felt like I finished, because I got asked to return a couple of times. But I felt like, you know, when I left prosecution, there was an overwhelming feeling that I was done here, that I did what I needed to do. And I wasn't even leaving prosecution for modeling. To be quite honest, I left prosecution. I had no plan A, B, C, D. Like, I planned to leave and I left. And I just decided that I'm going to try and find my center. That was my only goal. It was my only goal. I felt like I was somehow disrupted from a path I was supposed to walk. And I couldn't explain it to anybody. I couldn't explain it. I mean, my parents thought it was ridiculous. People thought, oh my goodness, but you just went into the regional court. I was the youngest person in the regional court. And people were like, this is going so well. Why would you leave? But I kept saying, I felt like I was finished. And that's the reason why there was so much. I was so resolute when I made the decision, even though I cried when I handed in my gown. I actually cried. But I knew that I was finished. I was finished here, you know. So no, I wouldn't go back, because I feel like I finished that path. So yeah.
Kwame is asking one more question that is connected to this job you had. I really admire your strength and courage. Would you share your experience as a prosecutor with albinism? How do people perceive you, especially dealing with rape cases, as you mentioned earlier?
You know, was
it okay? I mean, did you really see some different approach because of that?
You know, this is the interesting thing. I feel like sometimes it's difficult to pinpoint which identity is under attack, you know. If you had asked me this question 6 years ago, I would have said it's my gender. My gender was under attack, you know, in that people would somewhat speak to you as if you're a child, or they would dismiss, you know, what it is that you're saying, or that some complainants may not necessarily be entirely comfortable sort of speaking with you. But I always, in my mind, I would think it's because I'm a woman, you know, and law is a generally very male-dominated profession. If you ask me now, I'll say I honestly don't know. I don't know, because I wasn't, at that time, I don't even think that I was entirely as politically aware or as politically educated as I am now. So I don't think I was entirely deconstructing in the same way that I do now. So if you would ask me, I would say that definitely there was a reference. I would see that there was a reference in being treated differently, but I wouldn't know whether it was specifically because I had albinism or because I was a woman, but also, again, it depends on the context, because I can tell you, for instance, the senior who took me to the regional court, she was incredibly enabling in terms of, you know, who I was, how I grew in that space. So also the sort of context, even within the work environment, context, who your senior is, who your magistrate is, the complainants that come to you, there's always sort of a situational consequence. And yeah, so it would depend sometimes, but whenever there was different treatment, I think I generally thought it was gender, and no, I'm not entirely sure. So yeah.
In many ways, you are a living example of an inspiration or an idol for many people, I think. How important representation, in your opinion, is? Does it have a power to change lives or others' opinions?
Sorry, could you please repeat that question?
Like, does the representation have a power to change lives of people? I mean it like that you are inspiration for the others. Do you think that if there are people like you representing some kind of people in the society, can it change life of others that are in similar condition? Like the power of representation of underprivileged or marginalized communities in general.
I think representation is one of those ways where people sort of communicate sort of what is important within their humanity, you know, and because there's so many, the varied forms of representation. And I'll give you the smallest kind. When I got to school, and this doesn't even have to do with albinism, they would teach us A is for apple, B is for banana, you know, V is for violin. And I was thinking at that age, what on earth is a violin? I don't know there's nothing in my cultural environment that says violin, right? I didn't know what that was. And remember, you're not trying to teach me what a violin is. You're trying to teach me the alphabet, you know? But in terms of representation of my cultural environment, it's very European. It was very European, V for violin, you know? In terms of my cultural environment, I was not seen, you know? And I started understanding with time how much multitasking a child who is, and I'm focusing on a Black child, a child who is Black, who comes from a Bantu speaking household, how much multitasking they have to do, because not only do they actually have to learn the work, they have to learn about a culture that doesn't see them. You know, they have to learn V is for violin when they might not even know what that was, you know. So do I think that representation is important? In many spheres, representation is important because it's an acknowledgement of humanity. It's in terms of beauty, in terms of culture, fashion, almost everything. Even in law, there's representation. In economics, there's representation. In language, there's representation, you know? And I think that, yeah, it definitely, it's not even necessarily about even changing people's lives, it's about acknowledging people's lives. So, yeah.
So thank you very much for very inspiring HateFree Talk. I'm very
Thank
happy
you.
that you accepted my invitation and shared your very unique story and your very interesting views.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for having me. Thank you, Lucas, for having me.
Good night.